Well, hello. It's still morning, I think. I don't know if we're at 12 o'clock quite yet. Anyway, we'll just jump in. So really excited for this talk. Before I covered marketing and tech, I actually used to be a political reporter. So it's amazing how often these days these worlds collide. And so we've got a great panel up here. We can all have them introduce themselves, and then we can dive in. But obviously, CTV, programmatic advertising, all these topics very timely, not just for politics, but also for brands, as we all know. And so let's just kind of do a quick intro if you guys want to go down the row, and we can get started.
Sure. Ashwin, Navin, co-founder, CEO of Samba TV. We're a TV technology company generating data from over 46 million devices globally, from over 24 brands of television that give us a wealth of insight on what people are watching, shows, movies, commercials, et cetera.
I am Kurstin, Managing Director for MIQ, Mid-Atlantic Southeast, and oversee our political practice. We're a managed service programmatic company, really focused and heavily invested in the TV space, both taking an agnostic approach to data, inventory, and DSP platforms.
Zach Moffatt, CEO of Target Victory. We're a performance marketing company in the political space, focusing on right-of-center campaigns. And so I represent probably the agency perspective here.
And I'm Mark Jablonowski. I'm the managing partner and CTO of DSPolitical, which is an advertising technology and media company that supports left-of-center candidates.
So we have a bipartisan panel, which is great. So I think the first question, let's just talk about the CTV landscape a little bit, just for context, but also because that is one of the more booming places right now in terms of growth, and everyone's kind of seeing some of those stats in terms of how much is being spent there, the viewership and whatnot, and obviously you've got more ads and more content on there. And so Ashwin, want to give us a little kind of picture of what growth are you guys seeing at Samba in terms of both with politics, but also across the board in terms of viewership and what's changing, let's say the 2020 elections or further back?
Well, first of all, thank you, all of you. Coming up from DC this week is a real privilege for all of us because this is peak season. As we all know, we've got an election in less than a month. Election spend this year is, for a midterm election, going to be a record high. May even exceed what we saw in 2020, which was the presidential election. What's happened over the last 2 years, not only has spend grown, from our perspective, consumer behaviors, consumer attention is in a completely different place today than where it was in the last election. So it's putting a lot of emphasis this cycle on really understanding where is consumer attention, especially in these battleground districts and states, which I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about from you guys. But in key battlegrounds, what we've done is looked at our data. We've partnered with Harris to poll consumers to figure out where their attention is. And definitely the consumer is different today. In key battlegrounds, more than half of people are reporting to not have traditional television anymore. We've seen their behaviors dramatically different, shifting to streaming. But independent voters, when we ask them, 70% of them don't watch traditional television anymore. So that means when these elections come down to 1% of the electorate, it's absolutely critical to embrace streaming, connected TV, to really, create a decisive victory for either party. So excited to hear more about how the team's looking at it.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, just thinking about that lack of viewership on traditional television, because Melissa, MIQ just recently did some research, right, where it's showing kind of where the viewership is versus where the ad dollars are. What does that break down again?
Yeah, so I think Nielsen reported that July was the first month where streaming viewership surpassed cable and broadcast, but there's still that disconnect between spend and consumption, so most spend is still going towards broadcast. In the research we did, where we leveraged our TV ACR data partnerships, and it's multiple partners, over 25 million US households, we see this extremely severe frequency curve where 90% of all linear TV viewership ads are delivered to 40% of all the households that have been exposed, where then 60% of exposed households have only seen 10% of the linear ads delivered. So huge frequency distribution problem. Can't cap linear TV, frequency cap it, but you can on programmatic, and that's where we fill in the gaps to try and flatten that frequency curve. We've also seen that, after 3 months of political campaign spending, we typically see that the cost of reaching incremental new households on linear is 10 to 12 times more expensive. So you have to take that agnostic approach to delivering CTV ads on multiple platforms, inventory, using multiple types of data sets to do so.
I think that's the hardest part about politics is that you have this very binary outcome, right? Like selling 1% more diapers doesn't help us, right? You have this finite day. And so you have to take that into consideration. And then also you have just the structure of the markets with DMAs not overlapping with states or congressional districts, are saying is, like pretty much $1 in $4 actually goes into the district you're looking for. So the amount of waste from the get-go is really pretty severe. But how do you do that? Because on the flip side, you're trying to drive message, and political is still in a very much one-week flight mindset, where they run a message for a week, they overlap, they're earned, they're owned, everything else against that. And so I think that's the chance, as people's consumptions changes, behaviors of the campaigns haven't changed. And so that's the massive disconnect. And for me, the shortcut would always be, if you look at consumption, spend should equal consumption to a degree, plus or minus. But we have consumption, 80% broadcast, and still this massive disconnect. And so I think that is the shortcoming, but also the opportunity for this as it continues to grow into it. That was what we see time and time again. But if you want to move numbers quickly, it is broadcast. The question becomes, what's the value of the incremental next dollar spent? And that, I think, is still up for determination.
Yeah.
I was going to say, in politics, we're very fortunate to have essentially a platinum level CRM file. So all of us are able to access the voter file that gives information about voting history, voter registration, and whenever we're able to take that and make the data addressable and accessible on new mediums like the largest screen in the house through connected television, I think that's where you really see some of this opportunity, because you've got this convergence of how do you buy the largest screen in the house? Do you go through it through broadcast, or can you go to it through a digital pipe, a programmatic pipe, where you can really get exactly the voters that you need to win an election? And there isn't a silver bullet. It can't be all one way or all the other. It really has to be a layered approach in order to reach your voters. But I think one of the big takeaways is use your first-party data. You now have the capability to, at scale, advertise to the largest screen in the house.
This is a really key point that we're hearing here in the political arena. What we learned from both of your organizations and from our clients in politics, something that can be very valuable for any marketer in any industry, in any vertical. But for better or worse, our voter files, all of the sort of the backbone for political advertising, whether it's in an addressable medium like connected TV or in broadcast, is all sort of resolved to very granular data about Americans, where we live, household income, demography, voting history. The whole identity spine here is sort of the modern marketer's dream. And so when we work with political agencies, we learn a ton, about what we can do to modernize not only in the political arena, but for any vertical.
So I'm kind of curious too, just thinking about that, all the data that is possible now through CTV and whatnot, and obviously there's a lot of benefits to that, but some other people might say that a lot of these companies are just becoming in some ways the new walled gardens, right? Or it's like they're kind of replicating what Google and Facebook did for social, but now having more of that black box. I'm kind of curious, both from your perspective as political advertisers, but also you as well. How does that? What kind of challenges does that create? And is that how do you kind of navigate that? Are you getting enough data from the CTV sources as you would like, or is there a wish list of things that you wish that they would add?
Yeah, I think we're in a really unique space where consumption has caught up to the desires of the political advertisers. The technology has caught up for identity resolution, and we are now able to get those signals in. But there are so many disparate publishers out there that combining that into a cohesive buying, purchasing power is difficult. And so we operate a meta onboarding and meta demand side platform that allows us to get as many different paths and pipes into the individual voter that we're trying to go after. And so we're load balancing across all sorts of channels, all sorts of publishers, and it's all about getting the ad to the specific person. So we're less giving less credence to where it's actually running, whether it's on a specific program, and more about who is seeing the ad.
I think also, MIQ leverages, like I said, we take a data agnostic approach to ACR data. ACR data is technology that has been built into the TV screens themselves, right? And so it's capturing both what you're seeing on linear and what you're seeing on OTT as well. So what we're able to do is look at, what are these advertisers spending on linear? What are they spending on OTT? Whether it's a walled garden or not. But having that agnostic approach to multiple ACR data sets lets us see a larger perspective of where things are being spent. I think the biggest challenge that we're seeing too is that we're seeing more political advertisers change up their creative from linear to OTT. So making sure that you can track both has been a challenge, but one where you can, like, there's opportunity there, right?
I will say that not all ACR data is created equal as an ACR company. The part of the problem here is that the OTT environment is kind of a black box. And there's limitations that what a manufacturer can do to track all of the OTT applications running on their device. As a neutral technology layer, though, if you're not a manufacturer, you can actually observe and track things that are unmeasurable. And producing that insight for the marketer is a key part of how we work with all of you guys, each of your companies, and try to really, I think, blow open that walled garden business model, which unfortunately seems to be prevalent today in the living room. The idea that we can bring measurement out and write a whole layer on top of these walled gardens is a key criteria for, I think, the marketers' stack today.
But
yeah.
And we're happy to help.
I think one of the challenges is, though, is that it's also a human problem, right? Like, the reality is, at the end of the day, the question is, where does this all live? Does it live with the people buying broadcasts? Does it live with the digital person? Is the digital person better at this because there's more data to bring? And I think we're still working through that there's still silos, that you have people with domain expertise who can't actually talk across. They don't have the capacity to actually think of it as connected TV, like connected with the media plans too. And so we see a lot of that because people are fighting for their part of the pie. And so we see that for us in the political space. It's often, I have to fill my broadcast bucket first, then I'll go figure out the rest, as opposed to saying 90% of my spend is going to 55% of my people. What am I missing? And politics is that on steroids because it's a finite outcome. But having done a lot of corporate work, it's not like it's completely changed because people still know what works. And there's a hesitation to changing the media mix, like in a vacuum, because we all say we're willing to take risk and get it wrong, but when we get it wrong, everyone wants to know why we got it wrong, right? Part of taking the risks is you don't know the outcome. If you knew the outcome, it's not a risk. And so there's this massive disconnect, and I feel like that's the thing every time. Everyone wants to know exactly what's going to work. So everyone wants to run last year's playbook, but the world keeps shifting on you in real time. And we're fortunate in our business, we reset every 2 years. Our biggest value add is actually creating the constant underneath the reset. That we're the ones that are ever there, because even the campaigns aren't there. If you're statewide, you're not there for another 6 years. So the entire world has shifted 6 years later.
Well, it's interesting, just to kind of jump on that for a second here, it was interesting too, just, jumping back and forth here between like the political implications of CTV and then also obviously the takeaways here for marketers that are maybe not in the political space. And I had this when I was thinking about this earlier today. I remember talking to, very different company, but 2016 talking to the then former CEO of Cambridge Analytica and what they wanted to do about doing what for brands what they did for politics. They opened an office here and stuff like that too. So it's interesting to see. I'm kind of curious. Obviously, different companies than you guys, but when you're thinking back to what it was back then with politics and the lessons for brands, right? Like taking some of those strategies. How is that different now? Because I'm kind of curious, Zach, to your point. I'm kind of curious when you're pitching, let's say, or like when you're talking, let's say, like whatever the campaign is, and like, hey, you should spend on, say, like broadcast versus digital or whatnot. I'm sure like agencies in the audience and maybe brands, internal marketing teams are having to also pitch, maybe their clients or their bosses on how do you take those risks and how do you spend and stuff like that. I'm just kind of curious, how is that different? Like, what is that pitch then, and how often do people maybe have an affiliate and an affinity for something, even if it doesn't work?
Well, I think that's the challenge. I mean, Cambridge is a good example of like the PR being better than the reality, right? Like this is an example of something that doesn't always work, and people talk about it, and that's where the disconnect is, because you're asking a lot of trust. And so people will come to us, in June, July of an even year and say, we have this solution. No one's tried it before, but if you do, you'll win. And like, we can't, right? We're like a submarine, it's gone under. There's no changing the team at that stage. So you're looking through those pieces. We do have a better feedback loop in as much as that we're constantly polling. So that is something that gives us some sort of indication. So we've seen that time and time again this cycle, that we are unable to move certain voting blocks. And when you dig in, it's because the consumption has been wrong. Like you're actually hitting the wrong people, consistently thinking you're getting white males, this age group, and it's actually just a complete disconnect. So we do have that signal that comes back, but we don't have that kind of last conversion, right? We don't have that sale point that we can look to. Ours is a very even with early vote, the next 21 days are the entire ballgame. Like this is everything, right? And the macro environment has shifted massively in 4 months. So even if you built these proprietary models, who you thought you were turning out may actually not be with you now. If you built your things in the summer, it looks completely different now, today. And so there's all these kind of factors, but we are constantly in the field, and that's our feedback loop, which I think this has been the first cycle where we could prove that people were buying incorrectly and not being able to move numbers. The challenge is still, there are people who buy broadcast who get CTV like slapped on through an IO and say, we've got it covered. And that's where we see, because that's not moving it.
And I would say to that effect, like when we see campaigns by CTV directly through the publishers, we see that same frequency distribution curve. And we're able to see it through our ACR data that, we take that agnostic approach, Ashwin. So some of our ACR data, we do capture the OTT data as well. And see, we see that same frequency distribution curve where 70 to 90% of all the impressions go to 20 to 40% of the household. So you need to use programmatic for frequency capping and reaching individual voters through the voter file with our device ID graphs.
There's one other point I'd make. In addition to measurement transparency, which we can provide, from programmatic lens, fidelity of data is a point I totally agree with. But there's also something that we viscerally feel in the political arena, which every marketer should understand, which is that Cambridge put a big spotlight on third-party data, not only for the fidelity issues, but the privacy issue. I mean, Zuck was sitting in front of Congress talking about how he's an ad business. But Facebook was also selling data, and that created a problem in some cases where the data leaks weren't even really a big business model, but put a lot of emphasis on privacy. And so I think the marketer's sort of lesson here is work with first parties, work with companies that actually have a relationship with the consumer that's consenting to the data collection, the tracking. So at least that the lessons you learn from this election cycle aren't going to be thrown away and having to be relearned at the next election cycle.
And it's always be skeptical. You have to have trust in your vendors. You have to have trust in your data partners. You have to have trust in the entire ecosystem. And it's incumbent on us to provide that to the American electorate. And that's something that I think we had a huge black eye from 2016, largely based on blustery PR talk more than anything else. And that is really something that we just all have to make sure that we're doing things ethically above board at every opportunity.
It's funny considering, I'm just drinking this water. This is not a pitch for DuckDuckGo, but it's ironic that this is sponsored by DuckDuckGo. But on that note, it's interesting too, just thinking about the land. I know there's been a lot of scrutiny on data brokers, both from the FTC and also parts of the bill going through Congress. And so when you're thinking, obviously, the first-party data aspect of things, but how has that changed right now, the way that you guys are thinking about the data that the partners you do work with beyond first party? Are you, how are you vetting differently? Or kind of curious if anyone wants to talk a bit about that, given the whole privacy landscape, and there is more scrutiny of who's responsible for XYZ.
Yeah, I mean, we bring our own data to the table, so we have access to essentially unfettered amounts of voting data that we build models on top of with our data partners. And what it really is the identity linkage from the offline world, because political campaigns for the better part of 4 decades have been run based on the voter file. So if you get a phone call, if you get a direct mail flyer, if you get a canvasser coming to your house, it's all going back into the same central repository, the same central database. And so we're looking for the identifiers online where we can match to those individual voters. And with deprecation of the cookie at some point, with iOS and Android identities being obfuscated, with all of the changes that are happening in the industry, which are a good thing. We need to have a consent-based framework out there, and we need to have stronger regulations in order to make this work as an industry. But we really have to vet all of our partners and look at what are the different technologies that we can use, again, in an ethical fashion in order to reach. So, I think in politics, we have the data. We don't really have to look for the data. It's how do we activate the data in a different way.
I also think, though, that I think that that's right. But the challenge is where you fit on all of this of leveraging your data, what you're trying to achieve in the objectives, and kind of where you're taking it. Because for us, part of it's also what you're delivering against that data. So for us, we put a lot of time to the other side of the ledger. I think creative and political is often completely inconsistent with how people want to consume. The willingness to refresh, to have these brand messages, but to realize that if 10 impressions is good, 20 impressions isn't better. You have to think through the various pieces of it. And so that's what we've grappled with too, is not just who you're delivering it to, but to make sure the message is correct. Because I think one of the challenges that people took digital and just thought it was like mail with video. We get it to your house and we're going to make it just like this. And that was a massive disconnect because that's not how people consume. So we've actually found, even as the data gets better, sometimes you have to loosen the parameters around it to let it kind of go a little bit to get more feedback in. I think the political folks took it so far that if it didn't match exactly, and we just kept shrinking and shrinking these audiences and giving up on people who could have got the message. And I think that's something that we've learned that probably others will learn because we had to learn it because we overdid it. We took it too far to the extreme. And so what we had to do was loosen and then acknowledge that we had to have more creative, more kind of turns with the general message being the same, but to realize that people don't want to see the same thing again and again. It's one thing when you're a brand, you have 5 messages in a month. I mean, we're talking like 15 impressions in a week and then doing it again. And most of it's negative. So it's like really terrible on every front. And so you have to be far more thoughtful about that because you're just achieving a different objective.
Yeah. Sorry, go for it.
I'd say 100% agree with that, and I think, expanding, like what Mark said, expanding outside the cookie. I mean, 30% at least of the audience is not addressable with a cookie, and so, what I've really wanted to test this year, and maybe, even into next year, is how do we take a voter file and map it to other identifiers? How do we then map that to, TV ACR data using these identity graphs? But it's definitely, audiences are getting killed with saturation and frequency online, but you're not also addressing like 30% of the audience online either.
2 quick points on it. One on the targeting side. In a high stakes battle, like what we're going to see in Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, 1 percentage point of the electorate will swing the election. And when the stakes are so high, and they could be a similar high stakes consideration for your brand, you don't want to be dealing with data that has very fuzzy fidelity. You want to know that you're reaching the cord cutter, and you want to deal with a company that can actually confirm that this is an unreached, underexposed household that you got to get to, or you might lose the election. So that's the first point on the target. You want to work with the first party. And related to the Cambridge Analytica thing, the whole point when Congress took a spotlight on Meta, its deals with all of its companies that were buying data and then brokering that out all dried up, and it put a huge emphasis on first-party data, whether it was from Meta or from Google or from any of these other companies. It's the same thing is happening in measurement now, where companies that are scrambling to replace the legacy measurement currencies are jumping into bed with third-party data, which is a total hazard in our view, because we've already seen this movie just like a few years ago. The idea that you can build a currency on someone else's data is just fraught with risk.
Yeah, well, it's interesting too. I guess a couple thoughts to that. I had like 2 separate questions I was going to do as a follow-up there, but I'm kind of curious too. What does this look like? Let's say like on, I guess like more of the cost side of things, right? I mean, you talked about like it being a lot more expensive, on different platforms now, and so what does that break to? Because I've heard just on the brand side at least, some linear stuff is cheaper than Facebook ads just because things are changing right now, and are you all seeing that too? And also this is the first election that we've had. Speaking of Facebook, I guess where you can't necessarily market on sensitive data like race and religion and stuff like that. So how does that change the way that you're thinking about reaching these audiences that you're wanting to reach?
Yeah, I mean, as you get closer to election day, the media gets more and more expensive. But I think something that's interesting about Meta advertising being more expensive, a lot of that is because you're not able to prove ROI in the direct response space based on the moves that Apple has made. And so you've just lost this huge amount of efficacy with a really good channel for donations or email acquisitions, anything. And it's been difficult for agencies that work with that to replace that.
I think it's also different in the political space than brand space because it's just a condensed time frame of when you're spending. So just trying to reach that audience or those voters, it just becomes incrementally like more costly to do so. But we see it in linear. We also see it in CTV. Just that the battleground areas are just getting tighter and tighter for scale, and things are going up in price.
Yeah. So thinking about just other platforms too. So remember a couple months ago at this point, there were certain groups, I think Targeted Victory might have been one of them, and a few others that had, pressed Google on making some changes to, the email marketing. Obviously, email marketing is a big thing for whatever brand, I guess. But I was wondering if you all could talk about that. I'm sure, Zach, you probably have a thought on this too, just for context too. There were certain groups thought that Google was putting certain political messaging into spam, and that it shouldn't go into spam, it should go into the main inbox. And so there was some discussion whether or not that should be allowed. And given that email is such a big category for a lot of marketers, I'm kind of curious if you all could talk about that a little bit. It's not CTV related, but I think it's another medium that people are trying to reach people on. And my Gmail has become a junk drawer. I'm just kind of curious what's happening with email marketing these days.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that I think this has been under the surface for probably a decade. but it's just come to the forefront because I think there's some third-party studies that verified it. I think that people are living that experience. I mean, things go into your junk, you pull it back to your inbox. Google knows better, puts it back in junk. So there's this like weird disconnect, right, of the way it is. And you talk about black box. I mean, it's the ultimate black box. They can't talk about it. If you talk to 3 different people at Google, you get 3 different answers every day. So there's just this massive disconnect on that, and I think that's where some of the frustration has been about what to do with that, because email is the workhorse still of a lot of this. I mean, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars probably not ever given as a result of it. You're talking about GeoTV that is not being there. People have signed up to say, I'd like to know my polling location. They're not able to do so. So there's pretty substantial ramifications of all of this, all of which need to be worked through. But on the flip side, I understand where Google's coming from, because it wouldn't indicate or highly score a donation or volunteering on the website as like a key indicator for why it should flag it higher up the stack, right? So I think what everyone's trying to identify is like Google lives in this thing. Google's solving for brands, but also solving for politics and First Amendment rights, and actually like legislation that says political information has to get into your inbox. So there's these weird disconnects, all of them thought out in real time publicly that we're dealing with now. But I mean, it's your cell phone. People get more and more text but it's, there's a process to that because it's a one-to-one human communication, which is different from automated. So there's all these kind of like underlying stack technology components that are being brought to bear. But we are seeing more people send out messages by text than ever before. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of millions, because you're bypassing the gatekeepers who are stopping you on other platforms. But conceivably, the carriers can still do that. So there's this kind of like real-time battle going back and forth that we see, all of which to get message in front of voters to hopefully inform them and to get more people to turn out. Because the one positive post-Trump that no one can take away is more people than ever are voting, more people than ever are giving, more people are active. Like, this will be the largest election, non-presidential, and that's a good thing. But there are still a lot of things going on.
Yeah. So that's a good point too, because whether it's text or email or TV data, whatnot, none of these are quite regulated like a lot of the traditional FEC rules and stuff like that. And so I'm kind of curious, given that there is this big piece of legislation in Congress right now around regulating online advertising and whatnot. I'm kind of curious, should it be regulated? I'm kind of curious too, what needs to be updated in terms of how brands or political advertisers are I guess reaching people across these different platforms?
I mean, we really need to have a framework at a federal level, so we're not dealing with state-level compliance issues or even county-level compliance issues. There's a good example in Washington State. There's a law in the book that prevents a lot of digital advertising from happening there because they're applying a broadcast regulation from 40 or 50 years ago to a digital medium where you literally cannot be upholding that in an easy fashion. And so we definitely need some sort of framework to help us facilitate the better communication with voters, which is so important for increasing participation in democracy and ultimately us coming together as a country.
I totally agree. I mean, we need a privacy law badly. I mean, the idea that every state's going to have a slightly different interpretation, that we're always going to be catching up to Europe stepping it up a notch, California stepping it up a notch, finally enforcing CPRA. Like, the idea that this won't be uniformly, implemented across the country is it's not great. I'm probably going to lose my bet. I had a bet that we'd get a privacy law this year. Maybe I'll lose that bet, but I think it's inevitable that we end up with national legislation, which would be wonderful for our industry. As scary as it might be, it'd be wonderful to have clear rules of the game.
Yeah. So we're almost at time. Just one last quick question, then we'll leave it open for any last thoughts. But on the non-paid, given that say with the whole thing that's going on with Twitter and Elon Musk, so if Elon were to buy Twitter, let's say that goes through, how does it change political advertising on Twitter?
Well, there already are not a ton of voters on Twitter right now. It's 1 in 4 Americans, and it's not necessarily the people who are at Main Street. It's more the elites of the country. So there's not political advertising on Twitter right now. It is something that, if it turns into a free speech bastion where it, is like 4chan or 8chan, you're not going to want to have advertising there, even from a political campaign, even if it's allowed. So.
But it's still organic content too, is the other part of that. Yeah.
Well, I would assume that if Elon buys it, part of it is to actually put a business plan in place to make it be a successful company. So I would assume that that's probably underlying it, because I think all of us who did this, it wasn't good at direct response, it wasn't particularly good at like high-end leverage touch points. I mean, it's speaking to a small community. So I think if you imagine it through the lens you're seeing it now, I think that would probably be misunderstanding how it's going to be looked at. What it means as it relates to earned media, ability to drive message, those type of things. I mean, that is also part of the question of this. Like, what does it look like? How does it function? I think campaigns still use it because reporters are on it, right? Like, it's a nice little reinforcing loop of people who like to talk to themselves. So there's a reason that it happens like that, and there's a reason that Twitter's not real life, right? Like, this is the massive disconnect. You go look at what is driving people's decisions to make the election. Like Twitter does not agree with the polls we're seeing. Like I get it, but like that's why we have elections, right? Like we'll figure this out.
Whether Elon gets it or not, I mean, love it or hate it, Twitter is where a lot of cultural icons are making their name for themselves and where a lot of trends are set, and it's an important place for marketing, whether it's in political or in any industry.
I think, and just one last thing there, if you could just take a fire hose of Twitter data and use it for understanding what people are talking about and use it to market elsewhere on other platforms, that could be useful too.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask for one more prediction question, but we're out of time. I'm going to be mindful of the next panel, so I think we'll have to end it there. But this has been great. I wish we had an hour for this. It's always tough to know where to navigate this. But well, thanks again to you all for your time, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.